This is something powerful you are going to learn. The person who speaks the least is often the one everyone listens to the most. Not because they are quiet, but because silence changes how power is perceived. And what most people don't realize is that silence is not the absence of communication. It is a form of communication itself. Most people believe influence comes from speaking well, from explaining clearly, from having the right words at the right time. But psychology shows something very different. The more a person speaks, the more they reveal. And the more they reveal, the easier they are to understand. And once someone becomes fully understandable, they become predictable. And predictability weakens perceived power. But there is something even deeper happening here. Why does predictability reduce influence in the first place? Human beings do not evaluate power logically. We evaluate it socially. In every group, the brain constantly assigns status without conscious effort. It observes behavior, tone, timing, and restraint. And one of the strongest signals of high status is control over speech. Not volume, not vocabulary, but timing. When someone pauses before speaking, then they don't rush it to fill out silence. When they allow space to exist without discomfort, the brain interprets that as confidence. And confidence is automatically associated with authority. But here is where it becomes interesting. Why does silence feel uncomfortable for most people? Most people are not actually afraid of silence itself. They are afraid of what silence creates. Silence creates attention, and attention creates pressure. So instead of sitting in that pressure, people rush to fill the gap with words. They over-explain, they justify, they clarify things that do not need clarification. And in doing so, they unknowingly reduce their own presence in the conversation. Because the more you explain, the more you dilute impact. But powerful people operate differently. They understand something most people miss completely. Silence is not empty. Silence is selective. It filters what is important and removes what is not. And in doing so, it increases the weight of everything that remains. But there is another layer to this behavior. What happens when silence becomes intentional rather than accidental? When someone intentionally uses silence, something shifts in perception. People begin to project meaning into them. They assume depth where there may simply be restraint. They assume intelligence where there may simply be patience. And this projection creates something extremely powerful: mystery. And mystery increases perceived value in almost every human interaction. But silence alone is not enough. Because silence without presence is nothing. So what actually creates presence? Presence is not about speaking more. It is about speaking with precision. Powerful individuals don't speak frequently, but when they do speak, they remove uncertainty, they bring clarity, and they end speculation. Instead of creating more of it, every word becomes intentional. Every sentence carries weight. And because speech becomes scarce, it becomes more valuable. But there is a paradox here that most people misunderstand. If silence creates power, why doesn't everyone simply stay silent? The answer is simple. Because silence also removes safety. When you are silent, you are no longer participating in the social validation. You are no longer feeling space to be accepted. You are simply observing. And for many people, that feels like invisibility. But invisibility and power are not the same thing. True silence is not withdrawal. It is control. Control over reaction. Control over timing. Control over information. Because the more you reveal about yourself too early, the more control you give away. But there is one final piece to this idea, something most people never notice. In many situations, the loudest person is not the most influential. They are simply the most visible. But visibility and influence are not the same thing. Influence belongs to the person who changes the direction of thought, not the person who produces the most noise. And often that person speaks the least, but when they speak, the room adjusts. Not because they demand attention, but because attention naturally moves towards them. So the real question is not why powerful people talk less. The real question is, what do they understand about speech that most people never learn? Because once you see communication through this lens, you start to realize something uncomfortable. It was never about talking more. It was always about saying less and meaning more.